Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Bakhmut, where the Russians have managed to make an advancement here to the south of Ivanivske. In the southern parts of the village, we see that the Russians have advanced from their positions here in the eastern parts towards the central parts and southern parts of the village, where fighting continues into the greenhouse area of the village. And with the central parts being crossed over by the Russians, they're pushing them towards the supply lines. This is a classic tactic where the Russians are leaving the escape routes open for the Ukrainians so that they don't fight to the last man, to try and simply push them out of the area. With the supply road open, they are able to just move backwards if the Russians continue pushing them through the eastern parts. So they're pushing them out of the village rather than trying to encircle it or cut it off. Considering the high and strong Ukrainian fortifications to the north of the village, it makes sense for them to use this tactic over trying to encircle it, as that would take a lot more effort than what Ivanivske itself is worth. We see that there's constant bombardment of the village itself with Russian FAB bombs and constant artillery hitting the village, which makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to, especially with how the village is largely just small residential houses throughout the village, with the greenhouse area here to the south. With the Russian advancements here to the south of the village, it is likely that the Russians are looking to push through the greenhouse area and back into the northern parts, where they'll look to actually push through the central parts as well, pushing the Ukrainians out of the village through the main road here between Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. With these recent advancements, the Russians will likely look to go into the forest areas here to the west of Ivanivske. By capturing the forest areas, they would completely cut off the Ukrainians in these southern parts from Klishivka and Andrivka and through the north. With all of these advancements and developments here by Ivanivske over the recent past days, the Russians have likely restarted storming operations, which have allowed them to push through and capture these parts of the village. And if this trend continues, they'll likely capture the village in this next week. When the Russian forces started their operations here in the direction of Ivanivske, the Ukrainians responded by sending reinforcements, which came in the form of the 17th Tank Brigade. But since then, there's been no additional reinforcements. This indicates that the Russians are now succeeding these advancements despite the Ukrainian reinforcements. And to stop this, the Ukrainians would likely have to send additional reinforcements or to grind down the Russian forces with what forces they have available, but this is difficult due to the lack of fortifications within Ivanivske itself and due to the high firepower of the Russians in the area. This forces the Ukrainians to be pushed back and withdraw from the village in these coming days, if this trend continues and the Ukrainians are unable to respond. We're seeing that throughout the front line, the Russians are pushing in different areas, mainly in the areas of Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and here to the southwest of Donetsk. This forces the Ukrainians to respond by sending reinforcements to all of these areas, together with the Robotyne direction, where there has been a stalemate over the past few days. And with this, the Ukrainians will have to redirect their forces from the Robotyne direction now that the Russians have been pushed out of Robotyne to these other areas to hold the line. They may send it to the Bakhmut direction towards Ivanivske or through to the Avdiivka direction. But the risk they run here is that if they relocate their forces from Robotyne, the Russians could restart their operations and try to regain their lost positions in Robotyne. The thing about the Ukrainian reserves is that they right now rely largely on infantry reserves rather than mechanized reserves. The Ukrainians have not really received any significant amount of armored vehicles or tanks since last year about this time. That is when they received the most. But since then, it has hardly been any. So the mechanized brigades and tank brigades they have available right now are the only ones. They do not have reserve units in that sense. There has been 4 mechanized brigades that have been training since October, but yet not ready due to the lack of armored vehicles to be equipped into their brigade. So they have the training, they just don't have the equipment. At the same time, the Ukrainians have a significant reserve of just infantry. They are manning the trenches and fortifications throughout the front line. This is why that despite the lack of reserves, the Russians are still unable to push through significantly because the Ukrainians have a lot of infantry to man the defenses. So as long as the defenses built, the fortifications built are strong enough, the Russians' advancements will be slow. This is why we're seeing that in the Ivanivske direction, the Russians are able to advance within the village itself. This is mainly due to them already having captured and pushed through the fortifications. They were slowed down by the 17th Tank Brigade of the Ukrainian forces, but now they are pushing through again. This is because the tank brigade is likely having a hard time holding back the Russian advances by itself with the heavy bombardment of the Russian Air Force and artillery onto the village. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the west of Avdiivka and the direction of Orlivka, Tonenka and Berdishi. The stalemate continues as the Russians and Ukrainians keep fighting positional battles, while the Ukrainians are trying to recapture these areas by Berdishi and Tonenka and Orlivka. While it's launching counterattacks, the Russians are trying to advance and capture Berdishi, leading them to get into a position where they can storm Semenivka here to the heights west of Orlivka and Berdishi. So with this, we see that there's continuous fighting and a lot of bombardment, but not really a lot of territorial changes as a result of this fighting. Moving further south in the direction of Krasnohorivka and Hrihorivka, we see fighting continues in Krasnohorivka. Some sources report that the Russians have made significant advances within the residential area here to the south, capturing the whole residential area, while other sources report that the Russians were completely kicked out. Until there's a clarification on this, there's a lot more positional fighting, and it's likely just a lot of back and forth, where at one point they were pushed out, and at another point they had captured a significant portion of it. So in the end, we do not know what's happening right now and what the outcome of this back and forth is. Therefore, we'll leave it as a gray zone. As for the Hrihorivka direction, the Russians managed to advance and capture these fortifications and trenches through the central parts of Hrihorivka in the Dacia area. With this, the Russians have now reached the residential area or the main parts of Hrihorivka, both in the northern and southern parts. And with these advancements, the Russians will likely look to gain control over Hrihorivka itself by entering the residential area and fighting through it. Yet again, the main force of the Ukrainians in this area is infantry based. There's not a lot of mechanized units. The Ukrainians are likely running low on armored vehicles to use across the whole front line compared to what the Russians have available. And this is likely due to two reasons. The first one is the lack of additional armored vehicles sent to Ukraine since last year. And the second one is the difficulty maintaining these armored vehicles since last year, as the majority of the repairs are likely to be done in Poland. And with the blockade between Poland and Ukraine by the border, by the farmers who are blocking main highways between the two with layers of hay and other things to completely obstruct and blockade Ukraine from Poland, this makes it difficult for military material and other things to get through as well. And there's also the fact that the Ukrainians would have to push things from the front line and all the way to Poland, whether it's in Lublin or elsewhere. This is a very long and far distance to have as a supply line. So the Ukrainians are facing difficulties with the logistics due to the extension of it, and this also adds to the difficulty in maintaining their equipment. As for Novomikhailivka, yet again, there's more positional fighting with no significant developments in this section of the front line either. Now, I'm going to be making a video series, 4 videos specifically about this summer, because everything points towards the Russians launching a summer offensive. So with that, I'll have 4 videos about this topic. The first one would be if the Russians launch one in the north, one in the east, one in the south, and finally one if it was a major offensive that is launched across the whole front line, north, east, and south. So that is going to be 4 videos separately into these 4 parts, and I'm going to be covering every single detail, and I'm currently in communication with both Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers to figure out the power balance, how much training each soldier goes into, and every single small detail as to how I can make these predictions as accurate as possible, because the current developments are pointing towards a very significant development happening this summer, so I want to get it as right as possible. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.